There is a sense in medieval culture of the power, malice and danger of demons and what they're capable of. Even if the monks had rejected demonic magic and were interested only in angel magic, could they be absolutely certain that if they thought they had a vision, it was an angel, not a demon?
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to the Glitch Bottle Podcast, where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm your host, Alexander F., and today we are talking about magic in the cloister with scholar and author Dr. Sophie Page. Listeners, I know you are going to enjoy this chat. Dr. Page is Associate Professor in History at UCL, that's University College London, and she's a lecturer in medieval history. Dr. Page became a permanent lecturer at UCL in 2002 after studying at the Warburg Institute, UCL, and Cambridge. Dr. Page works in the area of European medieval magic and astrology, especially in relation to Orthodox religion, natural philosophy, medicine, and cosmology. She's also interested in the imagery of medieval magic, especially diagrams, and in the history of animals in the Middle Ages. In 2013, Dr. Page published Magic in the Cloister, Pious Motives, Illicit Interests, and Occult Approaches to the Medieval Universe. This is a fascinating tome that details how, in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, a group of monks who had occult interests donated what became a remarkable collection of more than 30 magic texts to the library of the Benedictine Abbey of St. Augustine's in Canterbury. The monks collected texts that provided positive justifications for the practice of magic and books in which works of magic were copied side by side with works of more licit genres. I remember first coming across Dr. Page's work in the book Invoking Angels, with her piece entitled Uplifting Souls that discussed the Libre Razialis and the Libre de Essentia Spirituum, and also after chatting on the podcast with Dr. Joe Edge and Dr. Claire Fanger. Now, Dr. Page is the perfect person to tell us about how illicit or forbidden texts were treated by the church authorities and how they were actually perceived and defended by the monks and others in the face of persecution. But what does forbidden mean? What were the historical tributaries flowing into the Benedictine Abbey, and how did the monks navigate those waters? Could monks reconcile and practice magic with their deeply held Christian beliefs? Well, Dr. Page shares about all of these topics. She answers your Glitch Bottle Patron listener questions and so much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Dr. Sophie Page. Dr. Sophie Page, thank you so much for coming on the Glitch Bottle Podcast today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me. The
pleasure is definitely mine. Dr. Page, I know many listeners are deeply familiar with your work. How did you initially become interested in esoteric and medieval manuscript research?
So thank you for the question. It's slightly different for esoteric ideas and for medieval manuscripts. I studied Cloister at school, and we looked at the Knight's Tale, which is immersed in astrology and astrological ideas and has personifications of the pagan planets, and that's how I got interested in astrology. At the same time, I was reading quite a lot of fantasy literature, and I foolishly thought that I might like to try my own hand at writing fantasy literature. But what I discovered was that I was most interested in creating the world and thinking about the cosmology of a world rather than characters and their stories. And that's how I became interested in the medieval universe. And so from very early, what I wanted to do was think about how people imagined their world, how they imagined the forces in it, and then this leads into magic and thinking about how you might use these forces and more idiosyncratic cosmologies. Magic began very early, and then I studied history at Cambridge. I was lucky enough in my final year to have a supervisor, Peter Jones, who was interested in medieval medicine. And he suggested I look at a manuscript by a 15th century astrologer, Richard Trewithian. And the manuscript was in the British Library. It's his personal notebook. As an undergraduate, I was allowed to call it up. I couldn't read Latin, I couldn't read the handwriting, but there were lots of diagrams, all the horoscopes throughout this horoscope, and throughout the manuscript. And that was my first manuscript, and I was just incredibly excited by looking at a medieval manuscript. And a personal notebook also was very vivid, and that's probably where my interest in diagrams came as well. I was looking at horoscopes, and they were the most easy thing to understand in the manuscript, and then I started thinking about the astrology and everything.
Does someone with your expertise and experience now, Dr. Page, looking back, when you peruse a manuscript, is it like going into another world for you? Is it navigating probably ridiculously written Latin or really well-written Latin? Or how does it feel going through that process?
Magic, for all sorts of reasons, is quite buried within manuscripts. We're still discovering manuscripts of magic texts. And for me, what it feels like is you call up, and I'm sure this is the experience of many historians in my field, you call up manuscript and you hope something exciting will be there, but you don't really know. Because many magic texts, short experiments, they're buried in manuscripts with other content. So you're kind of looking through, hoping to find something. So there's the kind of excitement. Manuscripts aren't all equal. Some are, depending on what you work on and what questions you're interested in, some are more exciting than others. But the second thing is, if you found an exciting manuscript, you really hope that it's got a nice hand. Because in the Middle Ages, there are beautiful hands that are quite easy to read if you know the genre and can read Latin or the vernacular, and there are others that are really, really hard work. Even if you know the text, just deciphering them. But deciphering them, as long as it's not too difficult, is also lots of fun. I mean, it's like a puzzle, trying to work out what someone's saying. And because so many of the texts in my field aren't yet edited or published, sometimes you're the first person reading them, or one of only a few people trying to work out what the author was trying to say, why the person collected it. It's quite a new field, and that makes so many manuscripts very exciting.
Your book, Magic in the Cloister, talks about this group of monks that had these occult interests in the late 1200s, the early 1300s. Can you talk about, and maybe introduce to the listeners who have not yet read your book on this, a little bit about the time period, and why was this so important, this particular abbey?
The two most important things about studying magic at St. Augustine's, Canterbury, is first, it's a remarkable survival to have, I think, overall 30 magic texts spread across different manuscripts. And so we're lucky that they all survived. And secondly, it's very important because this collection and thinking about who owned it and why they owned it and what they collected and how they collected and where it was in the library tells us a lot about how religious insiders were interested in magic too, and how it fitted into their world view and their ideas about knowledge, their ideas about their religion, their curiosity, their personal interests. Because we're also lucky with this collection that we have, many of the manuscripts have inscriptions of the owners, but we also have the catalogue, so we can see how they fit into the whole collection. What we know now about the practice of medieval magic is that, on the one hand, it was a marginal activity. This is not a mainstream or an extremely popular activity, but it is happening at every level in society, within every group in society. So this is very rich in terms of thinking about illiterate people practicing magic, magic at court, magic as I was studying it in the cloister. And I wrote this book still in sort of quite early stages in the field, where we were really exploring, as well as who practiced magic, sort of some big questions, which I don't think have fully been resolved, about the relationship between religion and magic. And I still think it's really important to establish in popular culture as well that it's not just the church in capital letters working against transgressive magicians, but many people within the church were themselves very interested in magic and very open to its possibilities for exploring and understanding and working with power in the world.
When you think about England in the late 1200s, early 1300s, what were some of the historical forces? Were there manuscripts from different languages kind of pouring in? How did the monks deal with those? What was going on at that time?
Within the history of magic, the late 1200s and early 1300s is an interesting time. As we know from many other studies, the translating movement in the 12th and 13th centuries, it introduces new kinds of magic into medieval Europe, into Latin. So this is quite a well-known story now. From the 12th century, or earlier, with some texts of medicine and science, works of medicine, science, philosophy, and including the occult sciences, magic, astrology, and alchemy have been translated and disseminated into Latin. At first, there is a very positive reception of the occult sciences, all of the occult sciences as well. These are viewed as new, interesting technologies. They fit the ideas about the universe that are also being circulated in the more scientific and philosophical texts, ideas about the planets and their movement influencing the Earth, a new interest in nature and the possibilities of extraordinary properties in nature. But about from the second half of the 13th century, we start to see in all sorts of critical texts a backlash against magic. Critical texts from William of Auvergne, the Bishop of Paris, and others start to circulate, and it becomes harder to own these texts, let alone practice them, and not know that what you're doing is transgressive. So at this point, it may be that you're not afraid of getting into trouble with your authorities, but it becomes harder psychologically to justify to yourself that this is a pious activity that fits in with mainstream religion. But one thing we could say about the group of monks I looked at is that these are groups who probably had confidence in their piety and an interest in exploring the world, even understanding that pursuing knowledge of the world and powers within it is a way to get closer to God. Being fairly speculative, it seems we know that a couple of the monks were in Paris. It seems likely that some of these magic texts have come from Montpellier, where there were both magical and medical interests. And you can interpret the evidence in two ways, really. You could suggest that the monks who had been in Paris were worried about their occult activities, were thinking that it was safer to pursue them in the context of the cloister. Or you could argue more positively that going to university before entering the cloister was a very typical stage in a clerical career, and they developed these magical interests at the University of Paris. We know that lots of learned magic texts were circulating there in the 13th century, and then brought them to the monastery with them. St. Augustine's was a wealthy and important and therefore fairly independent monastery within England. It had constant money troubles, but it was very large. The collection in the library was very large. It already covered lots of diverse interests. It would have been a fairly safe place in which to pursue occult interests, especially in the way that these monks did among all sorts of other interests.
Dr. Page, just to that point, I love in your book how you document that these monks really did have, if I may, a seemingly rebellious spirit. I mean, could you share with listeners about this, especially with references such as how St. Augustine's was, as you mentioned, one of only 6 monasteries in England exempt from episcopal control, and how the monks resisted rules that they thought were too strict, and they, quote, had a special dispensation to eat meat, wore fur-lined coats in winter, and were given a regular allowance of pocket money. So can you talk about their attitude here?
Yes. Well, I mean, this is as reported in William Thorne's Chronicle, and it's possible that it is in the Chronicle presented in a disapproving, moralizing tone. This is one of many currents within the Abbey that some abbots resisted and tried to impose stricter rules, and are usually not very successfully. There's a moralizing rhetoric, and it depends on the abbot a little bit. But abbeys were very keen. This is a kind of different set of religious structures to the bishopric and the ecclesiastical hierarchy in this sense, and they were very keen to maintain their independence. And there were political and economic implications to maintaining their independence, and all these sort of concessions for the particular monks of St. Augustine's, as well as intellectual ones. But obviously an independent and not very strictly run monastery is more suitable if you have unusual intellectual interest, let's put it like that. And we know that intellectual interest, that reading, that the collection of books was encouraged in the monastery. Having a large, significant library was, of course, prestigious, as well as an expression of the monks' piety, that they had many religious and devotional books. And depending a bit on the character of the abbot and the monastic environment, the pursuit of knowledge of all kinds, but especially to do with the natural world, could be very strongly encouraged. It seems very likely some of the monks had come from Paris. This would be part of their mentality and interests anyway. John of London and other monks have scientific as well as magical interests. So there's quite a lot of astronomy and astrology in the library as well.
One of the things, Dr. Page, that just blew my mind about your book and your research, there were so many things, but one of them was that the monks were encouraged before joining the monastery to bring all the books that they had, as many books as they want, even if these books were considered, quote-unquote, illicit. And I'm thinking, this is a monastery, and let's say you had some kind of, magical book or illicit book. Can you talk about the difference between having a personal library, quote-unquote, in the monastery, and then it becoming a communal library? Can you touch on the dynamics going on there?
Yes. I mean, here we have to speculate a little bit. We know that the monks had personal collections and that there is a communal library as well. It's not entirely clear whether they simply brought the personal collections into the library and in gratitude for their donation, the names stayed in the catalogue, but the books were placed with all the other books, or whether they were allowed to keep them in some sort of personal space. I think it's more likely that they were simply in the communal library, but what we do know is that even if this was the case, they retained a sense of which their books were and what their interests were, and we can tell, for example, that there's some borrowing between them because there's different hands all over the manuscripts, but we know which monks it is. So they're borrowing and copying each other's manuscripts. But in that sense, that there are new monks coming into the library with new collections of books all the time, and in a way maybe the sort of personal collection thing is less relevant because you bring in your books, but you might actually be more excited by someone else's books, if you know what I mean, because you haven't read what's in them before.
You mentioned that in your book that book donation was so important that the beginning of Lent was also a day to commend the souls of living book donors and to absolve the souls of donors who died.
Yeah. I think this is wonderful. This tells you again that perhaps even the monks for whom book learning isn't their thing are just aware of how prestigious it is to have an important library. It means also that you can lend books to important lay patrons, and this can be helpful for making connections. This is probably not the magic books that are being lent, but you never know.
To that point, Dr. Page, can you share with the listeners a little bit about some of the broad categories of these magical tomes that were within this monastery? You mentioned there's tomes that deal with image magic, natural magic. What are some of the broad categories when we think of these quote-unquote illicit or licit magical texts? So
the categories are, to some extent, created by modern scholars, and there is friendly disagreement over some of the terminology as well. For me, the categories, which I'll go on to explain, they're useful, they fit more or less into how medieval people would have understood them, both from a practitioner point of view and a critic's point of view. And with thinking about medieval magic, it's always useful to bear both perspectives in mind, because both are readers of these texts and thinking about them, whether it's in order to think how to use them or how to condemn them. So if we start with natural magic is a real category, possibly constructed or at least developed by William of Auvergne, the Bishop of Paris, who is famous for having said that he'd read magic texts in his youth, but now rejected them, but he was very knowledgeable about magic and condemned magic, but in very interesting ways. But he was clearly concerned, as many people were, in the 13th century, as I said, this positive reception of magic, to separate out what was potentially useful and interesting and fitted religious concern. So he constructed this category of natural magic, but for him it was simply the existence of extraordinary properties in nature. So he gives the example of the peony helping with epilepsy. But the examples are fascinating, I think, from a modern perspective, because they include real extraordinary objects like the electric ray and the magnet, but also fantastical creatures like the basilisk, which was thought to kill with its gaze. Now, what we call magic texts are not texts simply describing these properties, but those which explain how to use them. And books about the properties of stones, stars, because the planets and stars were considered to be natural bodies, animal parts and herbs in particular can fit into this category, although I would distinguish magical uses from medical uses. And these kinds of texts were not only accepted, but they were also promoted and overlap a lot with other genres like encyclopedias and medical texts because of the religious sense of God's good creation and the idea that God would put useful properties into every living being, everything he had created, in order for it to be useful for men and women. So there is an idea, for example, that all parts of an animal body had some use for humans. And some of these hadn't been discovered yet, so this might promote a kind of idea of experimentation. St. Augustine's monks had lots of these kinds of texts on stones, stars, animal parts, and they're on a sort of wide spectrum from medical texts like Sextus Placitus's work on quadrupeds and the animal parts of animals, most of which were medical, but then include some non-medical uses, to the Greek book of the 15 stars, stones, herbs and characters, which we would class today as a magical text, but in fact just involves the bringing together of natural objects. And so there is an overlap between magical and non-magical texts, and these St. Augustine's monks collected both, and often in the same manuscript. So this is kind of interesting because it shows how they're thinking about magic fitting into ideas about nature. Another category of magic that was very popular at St. Augustine's is what we call image magic, or astrological image magic, and there's an overlap with another modern category called astral magic, so it all gets very complicated. If I use image magic as the basis for the discussion, this is essentially the construction of an astrological talisman, an object which can be made of metal or wax or cloth or a mirror, which has rituals performed over it and planetary forces drawn down into it. At this point, from a practitioner's point of view, it could still be viewed as a natural object. But many texts, and there isn't really a difference in terms of the authors of these texts, then also will include prayers to spirits to draw down powers into the object, and sometimes the powers that are drawn down seem to have been viewed as spirits themselves. So here we have an overlapping category between magic that might just draw on natural forces and magic which draws on spirits. And this kind of magic, as it circulated in Western Europe, almost entirely came from Arabic sources translated into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries. There was another kind of overlap, which is with wax images, for example, of the Lamb of Christ, that were in circulation as pious objects. And in anti-magical and then witchcraft literature, there is a lot of anxiety expressed about the baptizing of objects. So what seems to have been the performance of ritual of baptism over an object, wax or metal, that is then given some kind of power. And this borderline between the natural and magic involving spirits is a very important borderline for critics of magic. The monks at St. Augustine's collected both types. They don't seem to have been bothered by this division. Also in play here are the goals of magic. If you want to think of yourself as a pious person practicing magic, you could justify using a technology for positive goals. From a chronicle entry about St. Augustine's, we assume that the monks did use it when some money was stolen use magic to try and work out who had stolen some money when there was a big theft from the monastery. Modern scholars often use astral magic to describe magic texts which involve spirits. The more explicit and deliberate use of prayers and invocations to spirits to help them draw down power into an object as part of the ritual. Some critics, such as Thomas Aquinas, argued that if a talisman worked, then it had to be with the help of demons, because although materials and planets did have power, so natural materials like stones and planets could have power, he acknowledged this. If the talisman was an artificial object, i.e. created by humans, then it couldn't work because of that creation by humans. Humans didn't have the power to create talismans, and therefore it had to be created by demons. But in fact, medical talismans, so talismans which had celestial powers drawn into them to use to cure people, were very popular and widespread and seem really to have been part of mainstream medicine, and especially common during very challenging periods like the plague, where we have a disease that physicians struggled to offer cures for.
You mentioned in the book that necromantic texts, specifically involving the conjuration of demons to do the operator's will, were not included at all in the library catalog or in surviving manuscripts. And you also say in the book that this is not as predictable an omission as we might believe. Can you share a little bit about why that might be?
Yeah. So necromancy is a set of rituals to conjure demons with invocations and prayers to God and the saints, with which you attempt to take control of the demon, protecting yourself with a magic circle, and then you command the demon, or demons indeed in many cases, to do your will, which can be for creating an extraordinary spectacle of battling armies or a boat, can be to make someone fall in love with you, to cause the destruction of enemies, hatred between friends, knowledge of the future. Flying horses were very popular, these sorts of goals. Frank Casson has argued in a very interesting article about masculinity that these goals are typical of clerics, ambitious men who have not quite succeeded in their goals that they had wanted. And the goals express envy of secular peers who had access to women, who had horses were part of their lifestyle, who might have achieved wealth in the favour of lords that was beyond the reach of these clerics. Now, clerics weren't the only type of person practicing necromancy, but this type of magic fits this kind of person quite well, and it doesn't therefore fit our monks terribly well. Also, the kind of emphasis on secrecy and the kind of instruments you need for necromancy would have been difficult in the monastery. We can start by saying necromancy is clearly the most transgressive kind of magic because it's about summoning the enemy of mankind to do your will. Now, the psychology of believing that it's possible to do this isn't surprising because priests were trained in the ritual of exorcism, so they were trained in a ritual that gave them control over demons. But the idea that you would want to summon the enemy is, let alone able to have sustained control over them, is pretty transgressive. So we could argue on the one hand that the monks were steering clear of this kind of magic. We could argue that in a wealthy, independent community, as we've seen, this was in some ways a privileged Abbey, so they aren't necessarily going to be in the position to want some of the things that necromantic texts offer. Where it possibly is surprising is we do find quite a lot of angel magic in this monastery, and as Claire Fang has shown in other monasteries too. We assume one of the attractions of monks for angel magic, which is the rituals to persuade angels to give you knowledge or angelic companionship or a vision of God through various ascetic practices. So we make the connection between monks' interest is in their aspiration to the ideal of angelic virtue, of the vision of God, of knowledge. But demons are also very present in the monastery. From the early Middle Ages, we have texts emphasizing the spiritual battles between monks and demons on behalf of the community, but also there is the idea that demons are particularly inclined to attack the holy. So if you're, on the one hand, your piety might give you the desire to have a spiritual experience and make a text like the Ars Notoria attractive, which offers a ritual to achieve a spiritual experience. On the other hand, you might think that if you're in the kind of mindset of battling with demons, spiritual battles with demons anyway, necromancy might be attractive because it's a chance to prove your will over the demons. But it's very possible that the reason that this group of texts survives all through the centuries is because demonic magic isn't there, because demonic magic is the category of magic that survives in fewest numbers. So in that sense, we might need to be grateful that the monks weren't interested in necromancy.
You mentioned, too, Dr. Page, that more often magical texts placed emphasis on efficacy rather than morality. You know, does it get the job done?
Yeah.
Can you share with our listeners a little bit about how did the monks reconcile their devout religious beliefs with magic that even may, in some rituals, some operations, may intend to harm someone else? How did they reconcile this theologically, practically? What was going on at the time?
Yes, I mean, in a simplistic way, this is quite easy to justify because rituals to destroy your enemies can also refer to the enemies of the church. Reading through all the legal battles of St. Augustine's Canterbury, you might suspect that their enemies are the bishop and anyone who is kind of contesting their ownership of property or rights rather than the enemies of Christendom. But the harmful magic aspect, which isn't actually a very large part of magic, but is present in some image magic texts, could be justified against the enemies of Christ, for example, or those who are immoral. So morality then, as today, is complicated in that sense. It's about an individual justification. So I'm not sure the goals of magic themselves are so important, but we see evidence of anxiety about the effects on one's own soul of practicing magic. This may be because the monks knew that some of their texts were condemned. It may be because it's a strong thread in religion that although spiritual experiences are something that can contribute to personal salvation, the devil can take the form of an angel very easily and trick people, anyone from a monk to a peasant to a king, into believing that they are having a good vision of an angel, which is far from the truth. So there is a sense in medieval culture of the power, malice and danger of demons and what they're capable of. So even if the monks had rejected demonic magic and were interested only in angel magic, could they be absolutely certain that if they thought they had a vision, it was an angel, not a demon? I'll give you two examples where I think this kind of anxiety does reveal itself. One is in a manuscript owned by one of the monks, Corpus Christi 125 in Oxford, at the end of one of the texts called the Glosses on the Book of the Moon. So this is a Christian gloss on an Arabic image magic text. There's a note written by the scribe, so probably the scribe rather than in the original text. If anyone practices this magic, the danger is to his or her soul rather than that of the author or the scribe. So in other words, this isn't saying explicitly that the text is dangerous for the soul, but that you're taking a risk, and the risk is not of the person who wrote it in. It's of the person who practices it. And of course, here we also have an expression of the difference between writing a text and being interested in it and reading it and then practicing it. And the idea that, to take an extreme example, the destruction of enemies, this can be practiced in one way or another. It might be appropriate to try out the ritual against the enemies of Christendom, but not appropriate to try it out against the bishop if the bishop is trying to restrict the monk's rights. And then we have another example in a text called the Book of the Cow, which is famous or infamous for describing experiments for how to create rational and irrational hybrid animals. So transferring the soul, the living soul of one being into another being. But this rather wonderful text has lots of different kinds of experiments, and it has an experiment that is good for the soul. And it's quite interesting because in the title, this is a suffumigation, so it's the construction of an incense that is good for the soul, is omitted in some copies. Some copies just then have the instructions which explain that it will make you feel sort of happy and calm and good. But others, and this is true of the copy at St. Augustine's, which is in the same manuscript as the other note on the soul I mentioned, really explicitly suggest it's going to be good for your soul. So maybe if once you could try out the Book of the Cow experiment after you've done a more risky experiment. Risky perhaps in the sense of its morality, perhaps in the sense of summoning an angel that might turn out to be a demon. Then you could try out this experiment that's good for the soul. The Book of the Cow is a very interesting text, and it's very interesting for lots of reasons, especially the approaches to nature within it. Because as I previously said, there is a very strong theme, perhaps even the dominant theme of the critique of magic by those who put it under scrutiny, is whether it is natural, that is, involves the use of natural substances and the drawing down of natural powers only, such as powers from the heavens, or whether it involves calling upon spirits to help you, whether this is good spirits, celestial spirits, or for most people it's inadvertently or otherwise demons. And this is the distinction that's made between acceptable magic and unacceptable magic. The way that unacceptable magic is identified is places where there are invocations or prayers, but sometimes also simply alien or exotic words, and particularly characters, magical characters. These shapes that in many cases were intended to imitate the shapes of constellations and draw their power down. So the Libre doesn't fit into this paradigm at all. It uses natural substances only. It doesn't have prayers or invocations to spirits. It doesn't have magical characters. Nonetheless, it's quite extraordinary and transgressive in its own way, because it has these experiments to create artificial creatures using female animals, male sperm, incubation in vessels, the idea of spontaneous generation where you put lots of worms, vermes, which is a sort of, worms is a kind of very loose translation of, into one vessel, and they all eat each other until one remains, and then you add different kinds of creatures into the mix. So hybridity is a very strong theme. And there are recipes to create cows from bees and bees from cows, to create hybrid creatures that are part bird, part fish, part human, and other creatures. But this isn't sort of scientific experimentation. The point of the creation of hybrid creatures is that you're creating something very powerful. And the creature, if it is a creature, David Pingree has argued that these are demons, is then immediately killed, and you use its body parts to do extraordinary things like become invisible, be invulnerable to wounds, traverse in mere minutes the diameters of the world. So on the one hand, it's the extraordinary creation of new kinds of living being, and therefore a bit like the Jewish golem. But on the other, it relates very strongly to what I discussed earlier about natural magic, the idea that every animal's parts have a particular use. So this is the creation of sort of super animals, which then their bodies are divided and used to create ointments, or its blood is used for extraordinary powers. So the text was considered transgressive, although actually not condemned in such strong terms as more what for medieval critics was more likely or more obviously demonic magic. So it was condemned because the creation of new beings was something that only God was supposed to be able to do.
Can you share with the listeners, Dr. Page, about some of the tactics that the monks used to divert suspicion of these magical texts in general? I mean, it's some pretty interesting ways that these very interesting monks kind of, not necessarily hide, but maybe kind of put them alongside more orthodox sections. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. There are lots of tactics to divert suspicion, and I've seen this in other manuscripts as well as other historians of magic will have done. And that sort of carefulness sits alongside the fact that magic is usually or often an expression of multiple interests in the natural world, in technologies, in craft, gardening recipes, conjuring tricks, more mainstream religious texts. Magic texts are often, I think, very genuinely part of an array of interests. And so with compilations, it's not that the other texts are there to conceal the magic so much as expressing an interest in all these different approaches to the world. But then on the other hand, to take the early 14th century manuscript from the Abbey, Corpus Christi 125 again, it's not surprising that the magic texts are towards the end of the manuscript, so they're not automatically visible if you open it up or read the beginning. In one part of the text, there's parts written in code, in a couple of parts of the text, and in a final example, and this is perhaps the most clever example, there is an excerpt from the 1277 condemnation of magic at the University of Paris, is at the end of the manuscript. So in other words, if someone critical did pick up this manuscript, which has a number of different image magic texts, I think we'd call the Book of the Essence of the Spirits an angelic magic text, natural magic text for creating talismans. First of all, if you picked it up quickly and flicked through the beginning, you wouldn't necessarily realize how much magic content there was in it. It's quite a large manuscript with multiple smaller items. And then, if it did arouse your suspicions, supposing you took it to the monk whose name is Thomas Weevelsborough, whose name is inscribed at the beginning, he might say, well, look, I've copied this condemnation of particular kinds of magic. I think the condemnation focused mainly on divination and demonic magic. I copied out this condemnation at the back, and I've checked my kinds of texts against this, and they don't fit. the monk could also say, the reason I collected them was because I'm scrutinizing magic with a view to condemn it, which is a defense that comes up a few times in the history of magic. So I'm just collecting the text. And it's true that, for example, that one of the most extensive and in some ways thoughtful critics of magic, William of Auvergne, one of the reasons that he's of great interest to historians of magic is because he read all the magic texts carefully, so he can condemn them in more sort of subtle and thorough ways. But this is someone who, must have had copies of the magic texts to hand to be able to do this. So he is also having to make this defense.
Did that go on at most monasteries and most places where people who did have these collections sometimes said, hey, listen, I'm doing nothing wrong. In fact, I'm even doing a more holy work by condemning these texts?
It's sometimes hard to tell, but what we know from the manuscripts is that approaches to illicit texts can be very creative. So another very interesting manuscript in this sense is Welcome 517, which is a 15th century very eclectic collection of occult texts, astrology, divination, magic, and alchemy, including demonic magic, so the summoning of demons, but mainly at the back of a sort of 250 folio manuscript, which includes also poetry, texts on roses and gardening and gynecology and various other miscellaneous things. This text has parts of rituals erased to make them inoperable, which is another thing which is also found in Corpus Christi 125. Now, are they inoperable to the owner, or does the owner know what those spirit names and ingredients are? It has, similarly to Corpus Christi 125, it has written at two places in the margin, this is not worthy of the faith, against magical experiments that are then not erased or cut out of the text. And in a couple of places, you can see that the folio has been cut out. There's just the bit of the edge of it still bound into the volume. And in one of these cases, it's a ritual to summon demons to make someone fall in love with you. And you summon them, one can see multiple layers in which this ritual is transgressive. You summon them by invoking God's aid to control demons, or control the demon Astaroth to send you his colleagues or his college of demons that will then make someone fall in love with you. There's an erasure of the name Astaroth, but you can still see it quite clearly beneath the erasure. And there's an erasure of the title, which says Conjuration, also fairly visible. But then you think, well, okay, you can read through these erasures, but you couldn't practice the ritual because the page has been cut out. But if you go almost to the end of the manuscript, there's an additional page that has been bound into the manuscript later, and this has the part of the rewritten out, possibly from a different copy of the ritual, the second half of the ritual. So you could actually perform the ritual if you wanted to. But because the manuscript has apparent signs of censorship, or actual censorship that's then been bypassed, you might feel that you were safely able to own this manuscript with transgressive rituals in it.
You mentioned, too, Dr. Page, that in some cases at monasteries, another striking aspect of some cases is that bishops often seem to have been unwilling or unable to impose severe penalties. Can you kind of just talk about the dynamic between these independent monasteries, but then around that you have this ecclesiastical prying and ecclesiastical control or wanting control from Rome? Can you talk about that dynamic?
Yes, the bishop's system of going round monasteries and inquiring about the way that they are run and the virtues of the monks and so on seems to have been more or less successful depending on the power and independence of the monastery. What is quite interesting is that when evidence of accusations of magic turns up in various monasteries, these seem to be kind of stock accusations of an unpopular abbot. So we do have cases where an abbot is accused by fellow monks of practicing magic or alchemy, but this is alongside financial misconduct, lack of virtue, favouring some monks over the others. So it is hard to tell in this case, even though we know from larger collections of books in monasteries that most monasteries had some magic, often natural magic or image magic. whether or not this reflects real occult interests by some monks or the abbot in the monastery, or whether it's just an effective way of accusing and trying to get rid of an unpopular abbot.
You dedicate many notes and a lot of research towards a book called the Libre de essentia spirituum. Can you talk about the Libre de essentia spirituum and this very important text? Why was it so important in terms of how it talked about the passion shared between spirits and humans, and also the different hierarchies of spirits? What is going on in this text?
Yes, okay. So the Book of the Essence of the Spirits survives in only one copy that we're aware of, which is, again, in St. Augustine's manuscript, Corpus Christi 125. It doesn't have a title. This title's based on a later title, possibly added by John Dee. It's interesting for several reasons. It appears to be written by a Christian and presenting a Platonic cosmology, and it talks about the spirits of the planet, so this is probably influenced by Arabic magic. It talks about what each group of planetary spirits is good for what types of magic you should use and what goals, in fairly typical ways, so Mars for war and Venus for love. And so it's sort of more of a theological text. It talks about the nature of God. You could use it to support practical magic text, but it's not itself a practical magic text. So its interest comes from its defense, because it argues that the writer of the text had a vision and lived in the desert with spirits, maybe angels, and so the whole text is presented as a vision from God, and this puts it in a sort of similar group to John of Morigny's Liber Florum, which is said to have been instigated really from a set of visions by the Virgin Mary, and somewhat in the tradition of the Ars Notoria and angelic magic text, that it says it has its origin in God revealing the sacramental art of the Ars Notoria to Solomon. But John of Morigny and the author of the Book of the Essence of the Spirits are contemporary authors claiming to have visions. And in some ways I would see this as Christian authors' attempts to make magic as close to orthodoxy as possible. Perhaps in order to silence critics, perhaps more likely for those interested in magic to justify magic from the perspective of their own piety, because both texts present themselves as following Christian sensibilities, as coming out of the, piety is a very strong word, the Christian sensibilities and ideals and yearnings for spiritual experience that many practitioners would have. Whether or not you call these texts magical, it doesn't really matter. These are texts that are of interest to people who are really looking for rituals that will enable them to have a spiritual experience, not simply express their piety, but move their religious ideas and longings into a more practical dimension. We think the Book of the Essence of the Spirits at one point had a wider circulation because or at least was viewed as particularly dangerous, because William of Auvergne sort of singles it out for quite a lengthy condemnation. And the aspect of the text that he singles out for condemnation is quite interesting, because he has a sort of diatribe against individuals who claim to be ascetic by going out into the desert. And so he seems to be targeting the kind of backstory of this text as a visionary ascetic. And what William of Auvergne says is, no, this person was evil. They were trying to gather followers for evil ends. Their companions were demons, because you would expect to find the devil in the wilderness, in fact, rather than angels. Now, angelic magic does go on to have a successful future, with John Dee, for example, in the 16th century. Both the Ars Notoria is the most popular ritual magic text with 50 manuscripts at least. John of Morigny's work circulates as well, particularly in monasteries. But for me, looking at the sort of broader history of magic, this is the moment that angelic magic fails to convince the authorities that this kind of mystical technology is a licit route to, for example, a vision of God. John of Morigny's text is burnt, and what we see perhaps more commonly at the end of the Middle Ages is text by author magicians, is a move away from the rhetoric of, I had a vision, and in this vision, this ritual was presented to me, and this is how to have the vision of God, and more to individuals like Antonio de Montalmo, who set out the theory of magic in much more sort of scholarly theoretical works. And the other sense in which the Libre de essentia spirituum is interesting is because it presents a fuller cosmology of magic than many magic texts. Magic texts have to present just enough cosmology, hints of the sort of hierarchies and nature of spirits to persuade readers that the rituals might be plausible. Magic is a fairly practical art, so you probably won't be inclined to try out a ritual unless you have some idea that it might work, even if it's a kind of, you're fairly skeptical. But it's more fun if you think you believe that it might work, or if you're really desperate for a particular goal that you might try it out. So they need a certain sense of the world and how it works to persuade the reader. And as a historian, I find these cosmologies very interesting because they're highly syncretic, drawing upon Greek, Roman, Arabic, Jewish traditions. They need to be plausible on the one hand to the reader, but on the other, as a magic text, what they're trying to do is draw together powers in the cosmos. What the author or the copyist thinks are the most effective ways to manipulate elements in the cosmos, like spirits or planets or stones or plants.
That is fascinating, Dr. Page, that you mentioned that, especially with this book, there was at least a historical potential to have a turning point, and that turning point did not happen. And I think that kind of leads into another point you make in the book, which is, you say, quote, the collecting activities of these monks illustrate a gradual shift towards more positive attitudes to magical texts and ideas, but that this was, of course, occurring at the same time as increasing condemnations of magic at universities and in legal codes and with papal intervention. So on the surface, this seems like, of course, a kind of a paradox. Like, how can there be all of this kind of pushback against magic at the same time of a more gradual shift towards more positive attitudes? Can you help us kind of unweave the seeming paradox here?
Yes, I mean, this is a complicated story, so I have to refer to parts of it briefly. On the one hand, magic is a very capacious, diverse and rich category, so parts of it are always viewed as more illicit than others, from natural magic texts which are never condemned to demonic magic. So the increasing positivization relates to the choices that people with wider literacy, the idea of wanting to and being able to have a spiritual experience, sometimes with the very mainstream or insignificant goal of trying to secure your salvation, has spread by the end of the Middle Ages to different groups in society. And we have the vernacularization of magic texts, which actually started very early in the 13th century with Alfonso's translation of the Picatrix into Castilian, but is happening more and more at the end of the Middle Ages. So positivization, because some magic is never condemned, other types of magic like angelic magic continue to be popular in spite of condemnations, and I think that's because people could justify to themselves their interest. That's one explanation. Another is to do with gender and witchcraft, that persecution from the end of the 14th century really gets diverted away from male clerical practitioners of learned magic and towards the persecution of often illiterate, often female, not real but imagined practitioners of magic. So practitioners of magic were caught, put on trial and condemned to death, often in context where their practice was considered not particularly transgressive but particularly inflammatory in a given context. So the context is an accusation of treason or trying to murder a ruler or predict their death. When persecution is directed at practitioners of witchcraft, at least by the 1430s, but slowly before then, it's in the context of a mythology in which the practice of magic, in this case harmful magic, is only a small part of what everyone is anxious about and frightened and seeking to punish and condemn and remove from communities. And that is the idea that men and women are forming pacts with the devil to overthrow the Christian community. And then they are also accused of committing very unnatural activities and of not only submitting to the devil but rejecting the Christian faith. So here magic is one part of a set of very extremely strong and inflammatory elements that arouse great sort of anger and fear, really. So we have these two directions, and learned magic also sort of gets picked up by various humanist currents in the Renaissance, intellectuals trying to understand the nature of the world, experiment with various forces, and there is a sort of merging of the categories of natural and image magic, and angel magic continues to be popular with people like John Dee.
To that point, Dr. Page, there's so many different elements that you detail in your book, Magic in the Cloister. One of them is that really when it comes to, some might think that ritual magic, for example, is separate from image magic, or that one is solidly illicit and one is solidly licit. But could you share how these are mingled together in texts such as the Libre de Septem Figuris, where you're inscribing characters at astrologically appropriate times? There's ritual washing, there's suffumigations, perfumes of the art. Is there anything that you'd like the listeners to know about this kind of blending?
I think really the main point is that magic is syncretic and manuscript culture is very creative, so that magic texts change a lot from copy to copy. They transform very quickly for all sorts of reasons. There is the Christianization of Arabic jinn, as Julien Veronese has shown with the Thiba al-Mandel. There is the kind of simplifying for vernacular audiences. For those scribes and collectors interested in magic who might have access to several different texts from several different manuscripts, that when they copy a magic text, they rewrite it as well. They add in elements from different traditions. So this is one of the reasons that one of my most recent articles is focused on magical figures, because you can see the creativity really clearly here, how much images accompanying magic text change from copy to copy. There isn't a set sense. The ritual must be performed in this particular way to be effective. So I'd like to emphasize the flexibility of this tradition, its constant recreation of itself, the creativity of individuals, copying, collecting, practicing magic. Ritual magic is a very broad category. I'm not sure how helpful it is as a term, because I prefer learned magic when learned magic includes all texts under the category magic that's circulated in manuscript form and that were too complex to circulate orally. I find ritual magic unhelpful because it's often used in contexts that exclude natural magic, that sometimes exclude image magic, that doesn't have explicit invocations to spirits. For the monks at St. Augustine's, for example, this is not a helpful division. They collected both types within the same manuscript. And you have complicated natural magic recipes. They involve rituals as well. And it's a sort of slightly anachronistic term that privileges angelic and demonic magic over the other types, I think, too much within the Christian sort of grimoire tradition. So it's less sensitive to what medieval people's interests, I think, and the diversity of manuscript collections and manuscript collecting culture.
Dr. Page, you talk about this dichotomy, this kind of, more positive attitude towards magic, and yet in Europe, incredibly complicated relationships and the pushback on magic. And we do have a listener question from Joseph H. Peterson that goes to this point. He's been on the podcast a few times, and Joe's asking, one recent line of scholarly inquiry is looking for indications that a particular text or artifact saw some practical use. Dr. Page has highlighted Dee's annotations, but has she seen things like probatum in margin, corrections, stains, tears, folds, inserted slips, even obvious signs of haste and execution versus a royal commission? Any observations that Dr. Page can share from her personal experience with original texts would be great.
Yeah, this is a very interesting and very difficult question. All manuscript scholars are aware that there's a huge difference when you call up a manuscript and it looks almost pristine and beautiful, and it looks like a fancy manuscript that someone has commissioned and then put in their library because it's prestigious, or they thought they were interested, and then they never look at it again. And then manuscripts, particularly practical ones, which have annotations, crossings out, rubbings out, marginal annotations, the look of them is entirely different. And then the line between a manuscript that's been very well read and where you can know or speculate that it's been used as well as read is very difficult. And this is not just for magic texts, but for medical texts, for example. But it's particularly difficult for magical texts because, as I've already explained, there are so many ways in which you can preserve your manuscript from scrutiny or suggest that you weren't practicing from it. And the text rhetoric themselves is often to practice in secret, and secrecy is part of the rhetoric of the specialness and long mythical tradition of magic as well. So really, in order to think about use, we have to put all the evidence together, including condemnation, trials, evidence from the manuscripts. It was very difficult at St. Augustine's. What I could do with St. Augustine's is establish that if the monks wanted to make talismans, they had the means to do so. They had the means to make seals. They used materials like lead for piping around the monastery. They had an infirmarium, so with access to all sorts of plants and other medical ingredients. And the problem with probatum, or it is proved, is that this is part of the rhetoric of magic texts, especially the recipe tradition and demonic magic. Demonic magic texts often, especially the shorter rituals, have the heading experimentum and then end with probatum est, and it was proved. But this is a rhetoric to the reader to persuade them that the ritual or recipe will work. I think one of the important things to say is that magic is a practical art, and there is some evidence that some texts are sometimes read for their sort of fantastical, literary, escapist quality. One of the magic texts of St. Augustine's, the angelic magic text, the Libre, was collected with literary works. But in general, this just don't strike me as the kind of text that you would collect if you weren't planning to practice them, partly because many of them are illicit, partly because they're sets of instructions for rituals or recipes. In terms of annotations and additions to texts and creative changes, we would say that there was practical interest and they were very likely to have been tried out. But more than that is difficult to say.
Dr. Page, even though there's so many, what are 2 or 3 things that you wish people either understood better about these monks and their place in history in this time period, and really about the medieval manuscripts that you present in Magic and the Cloister? And what are 2 or 3 things that maybe you think people misunderstand about these monks that you wish they understood better?
I mean, I still hear, I still read, I still see on the internet, I still hear from my students quite a lot this idea of the church in capital letters being against magic, persecuting magicians, being part of a sort of patriarchal order. So this always makes me want to stress the fact that one of the extraordinary and wonderful things about studying magic is that it's practiced at every level of society, in every group, in different ways, maybe for different reasons, with different texts being prominent, but there is no us against them as such. And my monks are religious insiders. They are interested in magic, not in spite of their religious inclinations and Christian sensibilities, but often, and particularly in the case of angelic magic, but not only because of these interests, because of their yearning for a spiritual experience, because of their interest in this forming yet invisible world of spirits, and the idea that there might be extraordinary properties in natural objects that haven't been discovered yet. So magic is really, it's part of the medieval worldview, it's part of people's understanding of their universe. It is a marginal practice. Many of its types and goals and the forms it took were viewed as illicit, but it was practiced by an extraordinarily diverse range of people. And the manuscripts are wonderful. but anyone interested in them, and I encourage people to be interested in them, has to understand that there is a lot of language and codicology and paleographical training behind understanding them. But I would encourage people going into study, going into academia, to explore finding these skills, especially now because so many manuscripts are digitized and really are available to be studied from wherever you're living in the world. The way forward with manuscripts is acquiring the skills and then looking through digitized collections. There are many more magic texts and rituals and experiments and collectors and practitioners to be discovered out there in the late Middle Ages.
And to that point, Dr. Page, we have another listener question from Joseph H. Peterson, who is asking, as a related topic, Dr. Page has hinted at, how can we better collaborate when combing through poorly cataloged material? And I know this is something that Joseph Peterson does. When I was speaking with Dr. Claire Fanger, I know she touched on this, but how can we better collaborate, or scholars like yourself and others collaborate when combing through this material?
I think it's getting easier. I think because we now, every year, with new academic publications, we have a longer list of texts to look for, and manuscripts are better catalogued, and finding aids are more accessible on the internet as well. In terms of collaboration, I think there's via digitization, there's a sort of opening up of archives, which has been wonderful for the field. I hope the Routledge History of Medieval Magic, which I just edited as an example of trying to bring scholars together and publish collaborative volumes. This seems to me at the moment more a kind of an easy way forward than conferences, because the scholars in this field are spread throughout the world, particularly, just to take an example, in the US and in France, in UK and Italy. I think in our age of climate crisis, flying has become more ethically problematic. So the age of flying to conferences and flying to archives has become more difficult, but these things are more accessible online. The field has moved on. It moves on, I think, every year, and this just creates more knowledge about what texts are out there. I do think there are many more texts, experiments, recipes, as I just said, to be discovered. But I think they will be discovered by digging deeper into manuscript collections, perhaps those that are the less mainstream ones that are now starting to be digitized. But there are many libraries in Europe that are becoming more accessible now.
When I speak with scholars like yourself or Dr. Claire Fanger or Joseph Peterson, I just will always come away with a massive amount of respect of the amount of time and dedication that it takes digitally or physically to go through these manuscripts and translate them and make annotations and put them in historical context. Are you an avid coffee drinker? Is there a lot of, because you must have just an extraordinary amount of energy to do that, because I know I would just even thinking about it, I get exhausted just thinking about that.
Yeah, I love what I do, or I would be doing it. I guess I spent a lot of my 20s training in manuscript skills. I guess I feel like I'm still learning on the job, and with every new manuscript I look at how to decipher the handwriting. I'm still puzzling over strange ingredients in many texts. Visually it really works for me as well, but coffee helps. And kind librarians in archives also helps when there's a nice atmosphere when you actually get to look at a manuscript.
To that point, Dr. Page, there's another question from Joseph Peterson where he's asking, where do you think the next big cache of unminted source material might be found? Are there specific libraries somewhere, or is there some place, some geographic location that maybe there is a collection of unminted source material? I
think as when I discovered with looking at monastic collections, there were a couple of very big collections of magical texts in them, but usually I would be going through the whole collection and find one or two magic texts. And I think this is probably the case in terms of magic's significance but marginality within medieval culture, there are probably one or two magic texts, sometimes more, sometimes fewer, but at least one or two in every significant collection of medieval manuscript texts. For those looking to find things, I would keep an eye out for new digitization and new cataloguing of libraries, but also working through the sort of bigger collections. One always finds things as well. There's much more to be done in the field, in short.
As someone with your level of expertise, Dr. Page, when you do go through these new manuscript collections or when you do take on a new project, is it a feeling of kind of you are discovering how much more that is yet to be discovered in terms of like, oh my gosh, this is the tip of the iceberg? Or do you feel that there is a grasp on kind of the amount of material that's out there? Or is it the other way around where really a small percentage is really known at this point?
At this point, I would say a large percentage is known of magic texts, and these are kind of widely mentioned in Jean-Patrice Boudet or Frank Lassen's books, Julien Veronese. But a very small proportion of the texts have been edited. And a magic text isn't fully known to scholars or indeed anyone until it's been edited, I think. So there is a Solomonis Latinus series. So Julien Veronese and some of the other French scholars are going to be, and indeed some of their students, working through editions slowly. The Libre Florum has been edited, the Ars Notoria, the Libre Almandal, the Book of the Essence of the Spirits, and the Book of the Glosses, or the Glosses on the Book of the Moon. And then there are some older editions. The De Mirabilibus Mundi has been edited. So say over 100 individual magic texts are known now. I would say under 20 have been edited. So this is where I think there is the biggest gap at the moment, that of a majority of texts are fairly broad knowledge, but little in-depth knowledge of the magic texts in general.
To that point, Dr. Page, we do have a listener question from Lynn who's asking, I'd like to know the favorite repository of documents or images Dr. Page has encountered in her research and why it was best.
I think it's more individual manuscripts. I think all of us and scholars of the history of magic, most of us tend to, because the beginning of the field required kind of in-depth look at particular texts and manuscripts, but all of us write quite general articles as well for different contexts. And you have your favorite examples for the more general articles or books. They're your favorite because they were important at particular points in your scholarly life, also because you know them really well, so you can see them from different angles. I'm very fond of the first, Sloane 128, the very first medieval manuscript I ever looked at, which is the Richard Trevithian Astrologer's Notebook. I love the British Library, but that's because I got to really do a sort of broad scope of their collection for my book, Magic in Medieval Manuscripts. That was really fun to do because I knew that they were going to have a sort of limitless budget for images, which is always nice. I called up a lot of manuscripts at the British Library when I was writing that book, and I knew it was for an introductory book where they would publish the images, but I didn't have to talk in depth about each manuscript. So I could call something up, find something to say about it, include it. And that was quite exciting to kind of think really, really broadly across different ideas of magic. And I sort of got to know the collection very well. But the best way to know a collection, really, rather than individual manuscripts, is to teach using it. And the two collections I use to teach with are the British Library and also the Wellcome Library in London, which is only 5 minutes away from where I teach at UCL. And they have a manuscript viewing room. They're very generous with their curators and library assistants helping out. And so I get to show undergraduate and graduate students manuscripts in that collection, including Wellcome 517, which has demonic magic. Also, they have some wonderful collections of natural magic texts and image magic as well.
Dr. Page, we do have a listener question from Bara Queenbee, who is asking, Dr. Page, what was the biggest mindset change you experienced from when you grew up versus your views on the world now?
The thing that really comes to mind is the climate crisis and the mainstream use of an understanding of the Anthropocene to explain our contemporary society. And I think it's the most important challenge facing us all today. And it's difficult when you're an expert in medieval magic to think about how to intellectually shift what you do, whether it's what I research or teach, to fit something that's so important but actually quite distant from where I am as an academic. So this is where my interest in the history of animals comes in, and we know how thinking about the Anthropocene and our relationship to animal extinction and exploitation might relate to the Middle Ages can be explored in two ways. One is the idea that people had a much closer relationship with animals in the Middle Ages in terms of their environment and experience, and thinking about the impact of that is important. And the other is this idea that our distance from animals and our capacity to exploit them comes out of a Christian mentality of human superiority over animals. So I've put these interests and concerns together with my esoteric interests, and I've started writing about animals and magic, and animals and demons and magic, and thinking both about what magic texts about animals, exploiting them, having supernatural control over them, humans turning into animals. There are really, really interesting ways in which animals appear in magic texts and stories about magic and animals. And so I'm trying to think about these. This is a very untapped area of the history of magic, actually, because a lot of people are focused on angelic and demonic magic, which sort of perceived in, especially in relation to history of religion, as more exciting in some ways. And I think they are exciting, but I don't think they're the only exciting part of this field. I've written an article on animals, demons and magic, which will be published in a French journal next year. And I'm writing about magic and the natural world, really sort of bigger questions about human relationship with nature, for an exciting new book that Michael Bailey and Claire Fanger are editing in the medieval volume for the cultural history of magic, which is a slightly longer term project.
We do have another listener question from Bara Queenbee, who's saying, if you could tell all occult people in the occult community, to do one thing, what would this be?
What I would say is that historians of magic do get frustrated at the way that some historical things seem to be sort of set in stone as kind of cliches. This sort of the medieval church being in control, and witchcraft is another one that often appears in culture in very unnuanced ways. And what I would say is to think about what history is carefully, because magic is a really creative, interesting, flexible tradition that constantly reinvents itself. And I think that's more interesting and more exciting, certainly from a historical perspective, than assuming that there is a set of magic texts that were practiced in a certain way and were condemned in a certain way, and magical practitioners were persecuted. It was very nuanced in the Middle Ages. And so just to sort of treat the history in a nuanced way, I think, I would say about magic texts. Many so-called modern versions of medieval texts, or so-called medieval texts, and don't bear any relationship to the medieval originals. And the medieval originals circulated in really diverse forms. I mean, this changes a little bit with printing, but not that much, because this is magic we're talking about. So rather than search for or assume that this is a medieval original, to kind of enjoy the creative transformations that this particular art has always had throughout history. The moralizing of it is complex and should be treated carefully, I think I would say, as it was viewed as complex and challenging in the Middle Ages as well. And I'm an atheist, and I don't believe that magic works in any sense, but I look at my community of monks at St. Augustine's, and I can see that they're a supportive community. They're sharing books, they're commenting on each other's works, they have shared intellectual interests, they're using magic as a way of thinking about the world in creative ways. It's part of their worldview. I mean, they may not have believed magic worked either, but just have been interested in trying it out or exploring what it told them about nature or God.
This next listener question, Dr. Page, comes from Douglas of the What Magic Is This podcast. You've touched on this a lot, obviously, in the earlier podcast, but he's asking, Dr. Page, how does one who is still a determined Christian, but who has a serious proclivity towards the dark arts, merge the two in 2020? Do the monks have an answer to this seemingly contradictory dilemma as you present in your research?
I mean, I think in some ways magic texts offered their own answer to this question, and that's why there are so many different kinds of magic texts and why they sort of seem to change from period to period, partly in response to criticism. So the Ars Notoria's response to it is, well, here are your pious goals: be ascetic, give to the poor, don't drink, be chaste, meditate for so many weeks or months. I think Julien Veronese has calculated that the full course of rituals would take 3 years. In other words, be a good Christian, follow these rituals, and you will have the vision of God. And then Antonio de Montalmo approaches it in a more sort of theoretical way, but he also thinks that he explains the universe and explains why some people are better practicing magic than others and where the spirits that you can call upon are. But he begins by saying that understanding the universe and understanding how to manipulate it as a practitioner is a way of also being a good Christian and approaching God. So magic texts answer the question, and then one thing medieval people were concerned about in relation to this question was whether the kind of magic you did was a choice of free will that only affected your soul, and if you were a monk practicing the Ars Notoria, maybe you didn't think it would affect your soul, or whether it was the kind of practice that was somehow contagious within your community and affected other people's souls. And this more negative line of thinking is what led to the persecution of witches. But I suppose the way the question was posed in the Middle Ages has relevance today, because the question is also, does what you do just affect yourself and your own moral choices and psychological thinking about this, or will it have an impact on others?
Dr. Page, when it comes to that kind of, magic from a historical perspective, to magic in a contemporary perspective, to magic even written about in a fictional perspective, we have a question from Kevin Carlo, who is asking, you'll have to ask Dr. Page if she's read that James Blish book, Black Easter, published in 1968. Have you ever read that one?
I've not. I'm afraid I've not even heard of it. Sorry.
I had not heard of it either until recently. I know Dr. Stephen Skinner and others mentioned it, but it seems to be the first book that is written with fidelity to the historic methods as they were written in the grimoires. Magic is not turned into Disney fairyland, and it is not turned into something that is explicitly selling your soul to the devil. So it is a pretty interesting read.
Yeah, I would always be skeptical that there is such a thing as fidelity to the historical methods, I'm afraid, because I look at the wide interest in medieval magical practice, and I see creativity rather than fidelity to historical methods in that period. I see texts like the Thornbook Venaris and the Libre Etielis telling people to write the text again for themselves, and then to call down to have your own familiar spirit, to learn the text in a new way. I would always say fidelity to what, given that magic texts in the Middle Ages often tend to circulate in quite different versions from each other, and knowingly circulate because people were rewriting them and recopying them and sometimes rethinking them or Christianizing them or making them more syncretic.
That is such a fantastic point, and I should clarify, in terms of showing historical method, I think what struck me about that book is it seemed to be the first book that actually looked at what was written in the grimoires, so for example, the Key of Solomon or the Lemegeton's Goetia, and actually showing someone going step by step through the conjurations that were written there, or showing someone, fasting the prescribed 9 days. Because you just don't, even in fiction, one doesn't see that. They just think, oh, magic, let's just throw a crystal ball and put a random sorcerer's hat on someone and call it magic. And it was rejuvenating at least to see someone going back to some of at least the more well-known grimoires and actually showing a character go through those steps. But I totally agree. I mean, it's like, how many people know all of the actual historical methods in all the manuscripts, especially, as you mentioned, that it's an ever-shifting landscape?
Yeah. I mean, the other point is that I'm not sure that medieval magical practitioners are trying to do that either. Although the magic texts, they often have mythical origin stories, whether it's a vision in the desert or a Solomonic revelation that construct a sort of validity to what they claim to be doing.
Dr. Page, can you share with us a little bit about your future projects that you're working on? You mentioned you've written an article on magical figures, and you started writing about animals and magic, animal exploitation and magic, being published in 2020 in a French journal. What other projects are on the horizon for you, and what can you share with our listeners?
Oh, thank you for the question. In addition to the interest in animals and magic, I'm also working on a project on idiosyncratic cosmologies, the starting point of which is the idea that everyone has some sort of understanding about how their world works and the structures of it and the powers within it. And so just trying to recover some of these, partly from magic texts and from popular science texts in the vernacular literature, such as Chaucer's Knight's Tale. But I can't say very much more about the project really because it's quite close to the beginning. And I'm continuing to work with artists, Annie Cottrell and Catherine Dowson, on projects related to Spellbound. So Spellbound sort of has a kind of afterlife, which I'm excited by. I want to still think about doing exhibitions in the future and working more on the visual culture of magic.
Well, excellent. And then the last question that goes right along with that is, can you share, Dr. Page, with our listeners, where can they get your books? Where can they read more about your own projects?
Thank you. I mean, I think there's just a list of the publications on the UCL website. There's a kind of range from the more scholarly to the more popular, and some books that are in between, like the Spellbound catalogue. So just to kind of have a think about the titles and what you're interested in. With the edited collection, The Routledge History of Medieval Magic, which is in an ebook, we really, myself and Catherine Ryder, the other editor, tried to bring together all the experts in the field, everyone we thought that was writing exciting research on different aspects of medieval magic. So if you've got a scholarly interest but looking for something sort of really broad and encompassing, then that's what I would recommend. And then the Spellbound catalogue for sort of the visual culture of magic. This was really quite exciting to put together and required sort of imaginative work and work with other historians from other fields, because the practice of magic takes place in the form of rituals. So often these are very ephemeral practices, and being secretive or transgressive, there is neither the production of high art objects nor necessarily a desire to keep hold of them once the ritual has been performed. So it was very challenging but also quite exciting to try and put together objects that were explicitly magical or somehow viewed as having power, or ordinary objects that had been ritually placed in particular locations. So to think really, really broadly both about the category of magic and how it overlapped and related to religion and science.
Dr. Sophie Page, thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the Glitch Bottle podcast. Really appreciate your generosity of time and your wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I hope your listeners find it interesting.
Listeners and Glitch Bottle patrons, I hope you enjoyed that chat with Dr. Sophie Page as much as I did. Her in-depth knowledge and her research on magical perceptions and approaches in the Middle Ages is so rejuvenating, and it's vital now more than ever, especially because we live in an age where we can visit almost any well-known grimoire digitally with just a few clicks. And I think Dr. Page's thoughts on how there was more creativity from practitioners in the Middle Ages versus quote-unquote showing fidelity to the sources, I think that is such an important thought that definitely needs to be explored more, especially when, as practitioners, we always want to tackle grimoires exactly as they were written. So that's such an important thing to always keep in mind. As always, thanks goes to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon, where you can enjoy exclusive perks and benefits, but most importantly, you, the patrons, help keep the lights on and you fuel the show in new and interesting ways. And I always love chatting with Glitch Bottle patrons. It is absolutely a privilege. You can always check out Glitch Bottle on Patreon, patreon.com/glitchbottle, and anytime you can subscribe to Glitch Bottle on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.